In the summer of 1944, a Japanese admiral aboard a destroyer in the Philippine Sea stared into the horizon, searching for ships that never came back. One by one, Japan's lifelines across the Pacific were vanishing beneath the waves. But it wasn't aircraft that were sinking them. It wasn't battleships. It was something unseen, silent, relentless, deadly. A ghost in the water, the American submarine. And by the time Japan realized what was happening, it was too late. Their empire, built on the sea, was being strangled from beneath it. Japanese admirals could not believe what America had done, or how they had done it. December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor. In one day, Japan crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, destroying battleships and killing over 2,000 Americans. To Tokyo, it was the ultimate victory. The rising sun flag flew proudly across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Singapore, from Guam to the Dutch East Indies. Japan had conquered half the Pacific in less than 6 months. But there was one thing they underestimated: what lay beneath the surface: America's submarine force. At the start of the war, few paid attention to the submarine crews. Even inside the U.S. Navy, they were considered outsiders, strange men who vanished beneath the ocean for months at a time. The Navy had 111 submarines at the start of 1942, small, cramped steel tubes carrying about 80 men each. They could stay submerged for only a few hours, and early in the war their torpedoes didn't even work properly. Many submarine captains described those first months as hunting with wooden bullets. They would line up perfect shots on Japanese targets, only for the torpedoes to dud or explode prematurely. Japan, confident in its naval superiority, barely noticed. They saw submarines as weak, support weapons, useful only for reconnaissance. To the admirals of the Imperial Navy, honor was found in great surface battles, not in invisible duels fought in the dark depths. That belief would cost them everything. To understand why Japan was so vulnerable, you have to understand how their empire worked. Japan was an island nation, completely dependent on imported resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron ore from Manchuria, rubber and tin from Malaya, and food, coal, and troops, all moving by sea. Every month, thousands of merchant ships carried vital cargo along what was called the sea lanes of the empire, and without them, Japan couldn't fight. Yet their admirals ignored this simple fact. They built massive battleships, Yamato and Musashi, the largest ever constructed. But they invested almost nothing in anti-submarine defenses. When the U.S. Navy realized this, it saw an opportunity. A silent war began. By 1943, American submarines were striking deep into Japanese waters. They hunted at night, using radar and sonar, attacking convoys that thought they were safe. Their tactics were simple: get close, fire, and disappear. Commanders like Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo, Dudley Mush Morton of the Wahoo, and Richard O'Kane of the Tang became legends. They perfected what became known as the end-around tactic, circling ahead of convoys under cover of darkness to attack from the front, catching the enemy by surprise. In one patrol, the Wahoo sank 8 ships in a single mission. Japanese naval records later described the attacks as unimaginable. Entire convoys vanished without a trace, leaving only oil slicks and burning debris. At first, the Japanese Admiralty refused to believe the reports. They thought storms, accidents, or Allied air attacks were to blame for the missing ships. But by mid-1943, the truth became undeniable. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. Oil shipments from Borneo and Sumatra, the lifeblood of Japan West Navy, dropped by 70%. Steel production in Japan fell by half. A confidential report from the Japanese Navy Ministry that year stated grimly, "If the situation continues, our ability to fight a long war will collapse within 12 months. Still, the admirals were baffled. How could America, the same nation they had crushed at Pearl Harbor, now strike so deep into their home waters? The answer wasn't just better technology, it was information. While Japanese ships sailed under the belief that their coded messages were secure, American codebreakers were working day and night at a secret facility known as Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. U.S. cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort cracked the Japanese JN-25 naval code. This allowed the Americans to track convoy routes, departure times, and even ship names. Armed with this knowledge, submarines were no longer hunting blindly. They were waiting in ambush. By late 1943, it was said that every Japanese ship that left port sailed into a trap it couldn't TC. The impact was devastating. In 1942, U.S. submarines sank about 180 Japanese ships. In 1943, that number doubled. By 1944, it skyrocketed to more than 600. Japan's shipping lanes, once the arteries of a vast empire, had become death traps. And the admirals in Tokyo, once so proud of their naval supremacy, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't fight, couldn't see, and couldn't stop. A Japanese officer later admitted, "We built our navy to fight battleships. We lost it to boats that never came to the surface, but this was only the beginning." Because as America's submarines perfected their tactics, Japan's desperation grew, and the battle beneath the waves became darker, deadlier, and far more personal. Soon, U.S. submariners would not just be hunters, they would become executioners of an empire, and the Japanese admirals would watch in disbelief as their mighty fleet and their nation's survival vanished one ship at a time. It is early 1942. The Pacific Ocean is vast, endless blue stretching farther than the eye can see. But beneath those waters, a new kind of war is just beginning. Inside a steel tube barely 300 feet long, 80 men live in darkness, sweating in tropical heat surrounded by the smell of diesel and metal. They call it the silent service, and these are the men who will change the course of World War II without ever firing a gun in a grand naval battle. But in those first months, nothing went as planned. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was in ruins. Battleships lay wrecked in the harbor, carriers were out at sea, and much of the Navy was scattered. The only major weapon America had left to strike back immediately was its small fleet of submarines. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, ordered them to take the fight straight to Japan's shipping routes. He called it unrestricted submarine warfare. From now on, any Japanese ship, military or merchant, was fair game. But there was one huge problem. Their torpedoes didn't work. Time and again, American submarine captains would sneak into enemy waters, line up perfect shots, fire, and watch in disbelief as their torpedoes bounced off the target or exploded prematurely. The problem lay in the Mark 14 torpedo and its Mark 6 exploder, a complex device designed to detonate under a ship's keel using magnetic sensors. In theory, it was revolutionary. In reality, it was a nightmare. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, which had developed it, refused to believe there was a problem. They blamed the submarine crews for poor aim. But in the field, men like Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, Howard Gilmore, and John Cromwell knew the truth. Something was wrong, and it was costing lives. One frustrated captain even wrote in his patrol report, "We fired 4 torpedoes. All hit. None exploded. Recommend Bureau of Ordnance test their torpedoes against a rock." By mid-1943, the situation was unbearable. Submarines risked everything for each patrol, sometimes spending weeks in enemy waters with nothing to show. Finally, one man decided to take matters into his own hands. That man was Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine's Pacific Fleet, known to his men as Uncle Charlie. Lockwood ordered live fire tests in Australian waters against old ships. The results were shocking. The torpedoes consistently ran 11 feet too deep, and their magnetic detonators failed entirely. Lockwood was furious. He famously said, "If the Bureau of Ordnance were in charge of the Sahara Desert, there would soon be a shortage of sand." Once the defects were fixed, the change was immediate and deadly. Now, when American submarines fired, Japanese ships vanished beneath the waves. While America was fixing its weapons, Japan remained confident. The Imperial Navy still ruled the seas, or so they thought. But beneath the surface, the cracks were spreading. The Japanese military depended almost entirely on maritime transport. Every tank, plane, and bullet required fuel, iron, and rubber, all shipped across thousands of miles. Yet Japan had made a fatal mistake. They had no effective anti-submarine doctrine. Their destroyers had weak sonar, their depth charges were limited, and, perhaps most crucially, their merchant ships sailed without proper convoy protection. Unlike the Allies in the Atlantic, Japan saw convoys as cowardly and unnecessary. It was an attitude born of arrogance, and it would doom them. As 1943 began, the U.S. Navy's submarine force was finally ready to fight. The improved torpedoes, coupled with radar-equipped periscopes, allowed captains to strike from greater distances, even at night. Submarine crews became masters of stealth and timing. They hunted along the vital shipping routes from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, through the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the arteries of Japan's empire. Captains began keeping personal logs, detailed accounts of each patrol. Some read like horror stories, others like epic adventures. USS Wahoo under Mush Morton and his executive officer Richard O'Kane became legendary for their aggression. In one patrol, they attacked a convoy in the Yellow Sea, sinking multiple ships in one night. When they returned to Pearl Harbor, they were greeted as heroes, the first signs that America's silent service was becoming the deadliest branch of the Navy. But success came at a price. Life aboard a World War II submarine was brutal. There was no privacy, no fresh air, and temperatures often exceeded 100 degrees. Men slept beside torpedoes, ate canned food, and lived in constant fear of being detected. When depth charges exploded nearby, the entire boat would shudder, lights flickering, pipes bursting, and the smell of oil filling the air. Veterans later described the sound as the devil hammering on the hull. And yet, despite the danger, morale remained high. They called themselves the lucky few. They knew their missions mattered. One sailor wrote in his diary, "Every ton of Japanese shipping we send to the bottom shortens the war. That's enough for me." By late 1943, Japanese admirals began noticing strange patterns. Tankers bound for Truk or the Philippines simply never arrived. Radio silence from multiple convoys stretched for weeks. In the harbors of Yokohama and Osaka, docks stood eerily empty. Rear Admiral Takagi, one of Japan's top naval strategists, reportedly said, "The ocean has turned against us. We are fighting ghosts." The Imperial Navy scrambled to respond, forming emergency escort units, deploying aircraft for patrol, even building small submarine chasers. But it was too little, too late. The Americans had mastered a form of warfare Japan had ignored, and now they were using it to squeeze the empire's throat. By early 1944, the transformation was complete. The U.S. submarine force, once crippled by faulty torpedoes and uncertainty, had become a lethal weapon of precision. They were no longer merely sinking ships. They were dismantling Japan's entire logistics network, one convoy at a time. Oil from Borneo could no longer reach Japan. Factories began running dry. Pilots couldn't train. Warships were left stranded for lack of fuel. And yet, the Japanese Admiralty still didn't understand how it was happening. They underestimated not just the weapon, but the mind behind it. Because the next stage of the war wasn't about firepower. It was about tactics, deception, and control of the deep. The stage was set for the submarine blitz that would terrify the Imperial Navy and shock Japanese admirals into disbelief. It's 1944. The Pacific is no longer Japan's empire of blue dominance. It has become a graveyard. Every week, more and more Japanese ships are vanishing. Some never send distress calls. Others are found days later. Lifeboats adrift, cargo lost, entire convoys gone without a trace. Japanese admirals are desperate for answers. Their sonar operators claim to detect phantoms. Their pilots report no surface sightings. But the truth lies beneath the waves. After 2 years of experimentation and brutal lessons, American submariners had developed a revolutionary tactic. One borrowed from the Germans, but perfected in the Pacific: the wolf pack. Instead of operating alone, submarines began working in coordinated groups of 3 or more. They communicated using encrypted radio messages, sharing convoy positions and attack patterns. When radar picked up a Japanese convoy at night, the lead submarine shadowed it, reporting every course change, every zigzag maneuver. Then, under the cover of darkness, the others closed in. It was silent, it was surgical, and it was devastating. One captain later described it as, like a pack of sharks circling a bleeding whale. In August 1944, one of Japan's largest and most heavily escorted convoys set sail, convoy HI-71. It carried troops, oil, ammunition, and supplies critical to defending the Philippines. 18 ships, 6 destroyer escorts, a floating fortress, or so the Japanese believed. But waiting for them in the dark waters of the South China Sea was USS Redfish, USS Rasher, and USS Bluefish. 3 submarines that would soon rewrite the rules of naval warfare. On the night of August 18th, radar from the Rasher picked up the convoy. Captain Willard Mush O'Kane, a veteran tactician, ordered silent pursuit. Then, with precision timing, the American Wolfpack struck. Torpedoes roared through the black water. Within minutes, the escort carrier Taiyo was hit, exploding into a fireball visible for miles. Moments later, the transport ships Teyamaru and Teyomaru followed, thousands of troops and tons of vital equipment gone. The Japanese escorts panicked, dropping depth charges wildly, losing track of the attackers. By dawn, 5 ships were at the bottom of the sea. The convoy was shattered. When word reached Tokyo, silence filled the naval operations room. Admiral Toyota Mitsuru reportedly muttered, "If even our strongest convoys cannot survive, what hope do we have?" To understand the shock of the Japanese Admiralty, you have to understand how they viewed submarines. The Imperial Japanese Navy saw subs as offensive weapons, meant to attack enemy warships, not defend merchant shipping. Their doctrine was built for Mahanian battles, grand fleets clashing under the sun, not unseen killers beneath the waves. So when American submarines began targeting logistics, Japan had no answer. Their sonar, or Type 93 hydrophones, could barely detect a submerged boat beyond 1,000 yards. Their depth charges were set too shallow, and their escorts often lacked radar altogether. In contrast, U.S. submarines were now equipped with SD radar, torpedo data computers, and later, acoustic torpedoes. A terrifying innovation that could home in on a ship's propeller noise. It was like bringing a sniper rifle to a sword fight. By the middle of 1944, the results were catastrophic. America's 200 operational submarines, just 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel, were destroying over 55% of Japan's merchant shipping. Entire trade routes vanished. Coal shipments from Korea, oil from Borneo, food from Indochina, all gone. The once busy lanes of the East China Sea grew eerily quiet. Sailors whispered about the Black Sea demons that stalked the deep. Japanese reports describe submarines appearing from nowhere, surfacing at night, attacking, then disappearing before the escorts even reacted. Even worse, American commanders began identifying choke points, narrow straits where Japanese traffic was forced to pass. They turned these into killing zones. One infamous spot, the Luzon Strait, became known among submarine crews as the Slot. Almost every Japanese ship that entered never came out. In late 1944, a top-secret meeting was held at Japan's Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. The topic, the submarine crisis. Charts filled the walls, red marks showing sunken ships, lost tankers, and crippled convoys. What had once been lines of lifeblood connecting the empire now looked like a body bleeding from 100 wounds. Admiral Takagi, grim-faced, presented the statistics. In just 6 months, Japan had lost over 1.7 million tons of shipping. Oil reserves were collapsing. Even warships couldn't leave port. One officer quietly said, "We cannot fight a war without movement. The Americans have stolen the sea itself." The realization hit them like a torpedo. America's submarines had done what the entire Allied surface fleet could not. They had strangled Japan's empire into immobility. Meanwhile, beneath the Pacific, innovation was constant. Submarine captains like Gene Fluckey of USS Barb began pushing the limits of what a sub could do. Flucky would later win the Medal of Honor for daring attacks on Japanese convoys and even a raid on the mainland itself. He once fired torpedoes at a convoy while running on the surface at full speed, under enemy fire, an unthinkable move that paid off spectacularly. USS Tang, under the legendary Richard O'Kane, became the most successful American submarine of the war, sinking 33 ships in just 5 patrols. But even these heroes were haunted by the risks. Each patrol meant weeks of silence, hours of tension, and seconds of chaos when the torpedoes left their tubes. Every time they fired, they gambled their lives, and the Japanese, despite growing fear, still had no idea just how the Americans could find them so easily. Unbeknownst to Japan, American submarines had another invisible ally: intelligence. Through the U.S. Navy's code-breaking unit, Station Hypo, American commanders were reading parts of Japan's naval communications. This gave them precise information on convoy schedules, routes, and cargo. So when a Japanese admiral signed off a convoy order in Tokyo, American submarines were already waiting along the route. To the Japanese, it seemed supernatural, as if the enemy could see through the ocean itself. One officer reportedly asked during a debrief, "How can they be everywhere? How can they know where we are going before we leave port?" The answer lay in a mix of human brilliance, technology, and daring, the perfect storm of warfare innovation. But the nightmare for Japan was far from over, because in the final stage of the submarine campaign, the Americans would take their tactics to a level so ruthless, so efficient, that Japanese admirals described it as a war beneath honor, and it would leave the Imperial Navy with nothing left to protect. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. The mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, once a symbol of precision and discipline, was now paralyzed, and the cause wasn't air raids or the loss of carriers at Midway. It was the silent hunters beneath the waves. America's submarines had evolved into something terrifying, a weapon of strategic strangulation. They weren't just hunting ships anymore. They were systematically collapsing Japan's empire from within. It began quietly, with fuel. Japan's war machine ran on oil from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. In 1941, before the war began, Japan imported over 22 million barrels of oil a year. By mid-1944, thanks to submarine warfare, that number had fallen to less than 2 million. By early 1945, it was almost zero. Factories producing aircraft engines stopped. Trucks were left abandoned. Entire fleets of warships sat idle, unable to sail. Admiral Takagi called it the slow suffocation of Japan. But what stunned him most was how fast it happened. In just 18 months, America's submarines had cut off 95% of Japan's merchant tonnage. The Pacific, once the empire's greatest advantage, had turned into an iron coffin. At the center of this storm were men like Commander Eugene Lucky Flucky of the USS Barb. Flucky was bold, cunning, and utterly fearless. He didn't just stalk Japanese convoys. He hunted them like prey. In January 1945, during one of his most daring missions, Flucky led the Barb into Namquan Harbor on the coast of China, a harbor heavily protected by mines, patrol boats, and shore guns. Under the cover of night, he fired torpedoes at anchored ships, sinking 8 vessels in less than 10 minutes, before escaping at full speed through the shallow, mined waters. Not a single American sailor was lost. When asked how he planned such an attack, Flucky smiled and said, "We were in a target-rich environment. I just didn't want to miss dinner." His raid became legend and a symbol of American audacity, but he wasn't alone. Richard O'Kane and his USS Tang continued to dominate Japanese waters until fate struck back. In October 1944, during an attack on a convoy, one of Tang's own torpedoes malfunctioned, circled back, and struck her. O'Kane survived, barely, and became a prisoner of war. Even from captivity, he had already sunk more enemy tonnage than any other submarine commander in history. These men were legends, but they were also part of something much bigger, a coordinated campaign of total economic annihilation. Inside the walls of Japan's Naval General Staff headquarters, panic had turned into despair. Convoy after convoy failed to return. Oil depots in Yokohama stood empty. Civilian starvation began to rise as food shipments never arrived. The Imperial Navy ordered emergency measures. Merchant ships were armed with small guns. Escorts were doubled, even tripled. Coastal waters were declared safe zones. But nothing worked. U.S. submarines simply adapted. They began prowling closer to home, along the Japanese coastline itself. No harbor was safe anymore. The once proud Japanese merchant marine, which had boasted over 6 million tons of shipping at the start of the war, now had less than 1/10 of that left afloat. A Japanese report from early 1945 admitted, "We have lost the war beneath the sea." Behind the scenes, American submarine warfare had become a blend of technology and instinct. Each patrol was now guided by precise data, radar fixes, decrypted communications, and aerial reconnaissance. American submarines were equipped with SJ radar, allowing them to detect ships over 10 miles away, even through fog or at night. New torpedoes, like the Mark 18 electric torpedo, left no telltale bubble trail. Japanese escorts often didn't realize they were under attack until it was too late. And then came one of the most shocking developments: acoustic torpedoes, nicknamed cuties. These small, self-guiding torpedoes locked onto the sound of a ship's propellers, homing in like a bloodhound on prey. To Japanese captains, it was terrifying. No matter how they zigzagged, slowed, or turned, the weapon followed. Many never even saw it coming. In official Japanese reports, survivors described invisible hunters and torpedoes that chased us like demons. It wasn't superstition, it was science, refined to perfection. In the final months of 1944, Japan's last attempt to save its maritime lifeline came in the form of Convoy HI-81, a heavily armed formation carrying oil and reinforcements to the Philippines. But waiting for them were the submarines of Admiral Lockwood's Wolfpack, led by USS Queenfish and USS Barb. In a coordinated night assault, the Americans struck like lightning. In just a few hours, multiple ships were torn apart. Oil tankers burned for days, painting the sea orange with flame. Lockwood later said, "They tried to fight the ocean, but the ocean was ours." By 1945, Japan officially suspended nearly all large-scale convoy operations. Their ships now traveled only at night, and even then only near the coast. But the submarines followed. The war had entered its final, merciless phase. By the spring of 1945, Japan was cut off. No oil, no steel, no food. The once mighty Imperial Navy had lost its ability to move. In Tokyo Bay, dozens of ships sat motionless, silent monuments to a dead empire. Even the legendary battleship Yamato, the pride of Japan, could barely leave port for lack of fuel. When she finally sailed on her suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945, her tanks held just enough oil for a one-way trip. That, too, was the legacy of the submarines, an unseen hand choking Japan's lifeblood. In less than 3 years, the U.S. submarine force had sunk more than 1,300 Japanese ships, totaling over 5 million tons. It was, by tonnage, the most successful naval campaign in history. And yet, it remained largely uncelebrated, because it happened in silence. No grand battles, no headlines, just steel ghosts haunting the deep. After the war, during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, surviving Japanese admirals were questioned about their nation's collapse. Many spoke of Midway, of Leyte Gulf, of the atomic bombings. But one admiral, Rear Admiral Noboru Ishizaki, said quietly, "It was not your planes that defeated us. It was your submarines. They destroyed our ability to live." The statement stunned the tribunal. But historians later agreed, Japan's empire didn't just fall from the sky. It sank beneath the waves. And for those who fought beneath the sea, victory had come at a terrible cost. 52 American submarines and over 3,500 men never returned. Their sacrifice ensured that Japan's war machine would never rise again. The ocean had taken much, but it had given victory in return. The silent war beneath the Pacific had reached its turning point. Japan was isolated, strangled, and broken. But the story wasn't over yet. Because in the final months of the war, American submarines would take their mission to a new frontier. One that would shock the Japanese Admiralty in ways no one expected. And the ultimate twist would prove that technology and courage could defeat even the mightiest empire. By the summer of 1945, Japan was not just losing the war, it was disintegrating. Every sea route was severed, every port under siege. But even in their darkest hour, Japan's admirals refused to surrender the ocean completely. They still had a few ships left, desperate, fuel-starved, and doomed. Among them sailed the pride of the Imperial Navy, the behemoth battleship Yamato. What happened next would mark the final act of Japan's naval war and the crowning triumph of American undersea warfare. April 1945. As U.S. forces closed in on Okinawa, Japan's Naval General Staff conceived one final suicidal plan, Operation Tengo. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, would sail south with a small escort. Her mission, beach herself at Okinawa and fight to the death as a stationary gun battery. It was pure desperation, a mission with no return. But there was a problem: fuel. Japan's reserves were so low that Yamato was given just enough oil for a one-way trip. There would be no refueling, no retreat. As the great ship slipped out of Tokuyama Harbor under gray skies, Admiral Seiichi Ito, her commander, reportedly said, "If we must die, let it be with honor, beneath the rising sun." But what he didn't know was that beneath those same waves, American submarines were already waiting. Far below the surface, the USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback detected Yamato's formation steaming south. Their sonar operators could hear the distinct, thunderous churn of her propellers, a sound like no other. They quickly transmitted her position to U.S. command. The data reached Admiral Raymond Spruance's flagship in minutes. Within hours, carrier-based aircraft were launched to intercept. The submarines had once again done what Japan never believed possible. They turned the ocean into a transparent battlefield. The following day, American planes found the mighty battleship and unleashed wave after wave of bombs and torpedoes. At 2:23 p.m. on April 7, 1945, Yamato exploded in a fireball visible for miles. Over 3,000 men went down with her. The sea swallowed the pride of Japan, and with it, the last breath of the Imperial Navy. The submarines had not fired the final shot, but they had guided it. Even as Japan burned from air raids and atomic fire, American submarines kept fighting, every patrol, every engagement, until the very last day. In July 1945, one of the war's most dramatic chases unfolded in the Sea of Japan. A small group of U.S. submarines, led by USS Barb, penetrated through the heavily mined Tsushima Strait, a feat previously thought impossible. Their orders: attack anything still moving. What followed was chaos. Japanese cargo ships, tankers, and even naval vessels were ambushed in their supposed safe zone. In a single patrol, the Barb destroyed more than a dozen enemy targets, including a train on shore. Yes, a train. Flucky and his crew launched a daring commando raid, sneaking onto Japanese soil under cover of night. They planted explosives on a railway line near Sakhalin Island and escaped to sea just in time to watch a transport train explode in flames. The blast echoed across the coast, the first and only time an American submarine attacked the Japanese homeland directly. Flucky's report to headquarters was brief: train destroyed, mission complete, no casualties, except the train. By August 1945, the sea around Japan was eerily quiet. There were no convoys to hunt, no tankers, no freighters, no warships left afloat. American submarines patrolled empty waters, their sonar screens blank. The hunters had no prey left. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded the Pacific Submarine Fleet, summarized it simply: "The Imperial Navy died of starvation, and we fed it the poison." Japanese admirals, once arrogant and proud, now faced the truth. Their empire had been built on the ocean, and it had drowned in it. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio. Japan had surrendered. In the depths of the Pacific, dozens of American submarines received the coded message: cease all offensive operations. Many captains simply sat in silence. Some wept. Others raised periscopes and surfaced for the first time in weeks, blinking at the sunlight. On the USS Archerfish, the crew celebrated. Their submarine had famously sunk the Japanese carrier Shinano, the largest ship ever destroyed by a sub. But even they knew the cost. 52 submarines and 3,506 submariners had never returned home. To the survivors, victory was bittersweet. They had won the war beneath the sea, but they had done it in the loneliest, most merciless battlefield imaginable. In the post-war interrogations, American officers asked Japanese admirals how they had allowed their merchant fleet to collapse so completely. Admiral Takagi, his face pale and weary, answered, "We thought submarines were weapons for small raids, not for strangling nations. We were wrong." Another admiral compared the American campaign to an invisible anaconda, squeezing tighter with each passing month until Japan could no longer breathe. Even Germany, Japan's ally, had failed to achieve such total destruction with its famed U-boats. The Pacific War proved that when used strategically and relentlessly, submarines could destroy not just fleets, but entire economies. The Japanese Navy had never seen it coming. The U.S. submarine campaign in the Pacific ended as one of the most decisive and underestimated mounted operations in all of military history. With just 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower, the submarine force had sunk 55% of all Japanese ships lost in the war. No other weapon system achieved such efficiency. When the war ended, America's submariners emerged from the shadows, quiet, uncelebrated heroes of a silent war. Their legacy reshaped naval doctrine forever. Every modern navy now recognized that the future of warfare lay not on the surface, but beneath it. The Pacific War was won by men we never saw, because they never surfaced to be seen. When the war was over, many of those old submarines were decommissioned and scrapped, but their ghosts still linger beneath the Pacific, rusting steel hulls resting on the seabed, silent monuments to a war fought in the dark. For Japan, the sea that had once brought empire and power had become its undoing. And for America, it was proof that courage, intelligence, and persistence could turn even the smallest weapon into a giant slayer. The silent service had spoken, and the world would never ignore it again. How close had the world come to witnessing Japan's own submarine revolution? One that could have changed history entirely, because as the Americans hunted from below, Japan was secretly building something extraordinary beneath its own shores. That's where our final chapter begins. The aftermath, the hidden weapons, and the shocking twist Japan almost unleashed before surrendering. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. But as American occupation forces swept through the ruins of Tokyo, Yokosuka, and Kure, they stumbled upon something that made even the most hardened admirals pause in disbelief. Hidden in the dark tunnels beneath shipyards and mountain caverns were submarines unlike anything the world had ever seen. They weren't the clunky, noisy vessels Japan had relied on during the war. These were sleek, enormous, and terrifyingly advanced. And if they had entered combat, they might have changed the balance of the Pacific. In late August 1945, American naval teams uncovered a hidden base near the port of Kure. Inside the camouflaged pens were 3 massive submarines, each over 400 feet long, longer than a football field. Their names, I-400, I-401, and I-402. These were not ordinary submarines. They were underwater aircraft carriers, capable of traveling halfway around the world without surfacing, carrying 3 attack bombers inside watertight hangars. Their mission? A secret operation known as Operation Arashi, or Storm. The plan was audacious: to cross the Pacific undetected, surface off the coast of New York City or the Panama Canal, and launch kamikaze bombers armed with biological or incendiary weapons. If those submarines had been deployed just months earlier, the United States might have faced the first attack on its mainland since Pearl Harbor. When Admiral Chester Nimitz was briefed on the discovery, His first reaction was disbelief. He reportedly said, "They were planning to attack us from under the sea, with planes." Extraordinary. The sheer engineering of the I-400s stunned American experts. They had a range of 37,000 miles, could circle the globe 1.5 times without refueling, and carried a catapult system to launch aircraft directly from the deck. One captured Japanese officer explained proudly, "We wanted to bring the war to your shores, to make Americans feel what we felt." But the plan had come too late. By the time the subs were ready, Japan had no fuel, no air cover, and no chance. The Empire had run out of time, and out of sea. There was one final, almost unbelievable twist. After examining the I-400s, the U.S. Navy decided to keep their discovery secret, even from their allies. Why? Because the Cold War was already beginning, and the Soviets had demanded access to captured Japanese technology. Washington couldn't allow it. So in April 1946, under strict orders, American crews sailed the I-400s out to sea near Hawaii. Once in deep water, they opened the hatches, set scuttling charges, and watched the colossal submarines sink silently beneath the Pacific. The records were sealed. For decades, the existence of the I-400 class was barely mentioned. A classified secret from one war, buried beneath the ripples of the next. It wasn't until 2005, nearly 60 years later, that one of the submarines, I-401, was rediscovered on the ocean floor, perfectly preserved, resting like a ghost of ambition lost to time. In the post-war years, the surviving Japanese admirals faced American interviewers. When asked about their submarine failures, Admiral Takagi admitted, "We had courage, but not imagination. You Americans used the submarine as a weapon of war. We saw it only as a scout." Meanwhile, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet, gave credit to his men, not machines. "It wasn't our torpedoes that won the war," he said. "It was our boys, who fought the loneliest war, under the darkest ocean, and never stopped believing we could win." Out of 52 American submarines lost, entire crews vanished without trace. Their names are now carved into a marble wall at Pearl Harbor's Submarine Memorial. Every year, families still come, whispering the same words carved in stone. They are still on patrol. The submarine war changed everything. It redefined naval warfare, intelligence, and global strategy. Before World War II, submarines were seen as limited, unreliable, even cowardly weapons. After the Pacific Campaign, they became the cornerstone of modern naval power: nuclear submarines, ballistic missile carriers, sonar detection systems. All of it began with the lessons learned in those desperate years between 1942 and 1945. Japan, ironically, became one of the first nations to rebuild a formidable modern submarine fleet, this time for defense, not destruction. The ocean that once divided nations now connected them in uneasy peace. Today, when divers descend into the cold, dark Pacific and find the rusted hulks of the I-400s, the Yamato, or the USS Tang, they are looking at history frozen in time. They are reminders of a war fought in silence, a war that changed the world, one torpedo at a time. The Japanese admirals who once mocked America's toy submarines lived long enough to see the truth. Their empire had fallen, not from the sky, but from beneath the waves. The P-51 ruled the air. The Sherman tank ruled the land. But it was the American submarine that strangled an empire. The story of America's submarine war is one of courage, innovation, and silent sacrifice. A war that few saw, but everyone felt. It's proof that sometimes the most devastating weapons don't roar across the sky. They whisper beneath the ocean. And in that whisper lies the story of an empire's fall and a nation's rise. If you found this story as incredible as we did, from the depths of the Pacific to the secrets of Japan's last weapons, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because next time we'll uncover another hidden chapter of World War II, one that even history books forgot to tell. Until then, this is WW2 Tales signing off, reminding you that beneath every battle, there's a story still waiting to surface.